Welcome back. And just to build on the last idea I talked about with mindset, I was kind of creating a smoothie this morning and I was wondering about how the cycle of rebirth can be something that we witness in one lifetime. And the reason I was starting to think about this is as I was writing about dogma and why a mindset can be something that hinders us. And we almost allow it to keep us in a certain frame of mind where we don't want to be flexible with the idea. So think, for example, about how some people think about God. If you are from a Christian tradition, um, you are a monotheist, but you have the Trinity that you're trying to kind of wrap your head around to explain the creation of Jesus in the world. So you're thinking the Father, which is there's something over and above the universe that brought this creation into existence. You're thinking about the Son, which is a variation of what Jesus could have been throughout his life, like the Son of Mary as a baby first, and then like we don't really know how to talk about Mary other than that maybe the universe, maybe Mother Nature as a whole, and then the Spirit, which is in everybody, right? So sometimes you'll hear people say, if you believe in Jesus, you'll be saved. And so in that way, it's almost to say we're trying to grapple with the universe as a whole without being maybe gender specific. It could be, you could look at it that way, because with certain languages, there are very specific uh, vocabulary around feminine and masculine terms. So this is kind of like you could say like an early postmodern way, ironically, of how to identify gender neutrality in a way to explain how God is ineffable. So I was thinking about how um, we wonder about rebirth in one life cycle. So for example, if I say I want to think that after my parents pass away, there's something that I can do for them, excuse me, that might help them if I believe in life in the grave. So if I believe in like purgatory, for example, I don't know if that's the lived experience of life. I don't know if that's like after we die, do we are we on this plane and then we're almost tested on how we lived our lived existence, and then maybe people on earth can help us, and then if they do, then we come back into life and we're healthy and happy again like anybody else. So these mindsets or these constructs are kind of what I was talking about last time with different stories and narration stories, or like what's called the Genesis, like an origin or creation story, that we want to almost use as a peg, almost just to kind of hold. Like if you think of a tent, it has to be really to construct it, you need to have something really grounded firmly in the ground so that it can hold the structure of the tent, and that way you can go in and out of it if there's wind. Hopefully it's not too strong that it actually rips it out of the ground, and then you go tumbling with it, right? So you want that kind of firm established idea inside of you to continue to evolve, and for you to feel comfortable almost going back and revising it and renewing it. So if you think about God, that's usually the trickiest beginning, right? And I talked about how sometimes talking about the 99 attributes or descriptions of the way God manifests in the world is the easiest way to think about it, because your mind isn't really constructed to grasp how the spirit is outside of any kind of creation, really. So um, thinking past God, if you think, okay, I'm not going to think about God now, I'm just going to think about life cycles, and maybe I'm going to go to rebirth. Like, I want to think about the angels, and then after we die, what happens to our soul? So I talked about, I'm going to posit that our souls kind of go into the archangel, for example, like one big messenger spirit, and then it kind of waits there, and then maybe after a certain amount of years or some time, um, people pray for something, and then it comes and it aligns with them, and then that soul maybe kind of reabsorbed somewhere in the world. Who's to say, right? So okay, so we're thinking about God now, we're thinking about cycles of rebirth, and we're thinking about spirits and angels, and then what? So what if we think about our parents as coming back into the world as children, right? Imagine in one lifetime. So sometimes we think about I had taken this course at Carleton called Death and the Afterlife, and the professor, I think she had kind of like a Buddhist background, but it was really interesting the way she described it. She said it's pretty neat that our evolution, as it were, allows children and babies just by their nature to be something that really brings out the love from within us. So she kind of asked the question, like, if babies were that cute, would we really put that much attention into loving them? And you think about children who, or babies who are born that are colicky, who cry a lot or have very difficult temperament at the very beginning. It's very, I imagine it's very difficult to be a single parent because you need that rest. You're sleep deprived. Your body's trying to cope with afterbirth. So postpartum depression does become a thing where sometimes people have an almost disenchanted idea about what life with a baby actually is. So bringing that kind of understanding into the fore with some of the old ideas we used to have about families having babies, what the norm is really good to reevaluate because when we have a realistic understanding of something, it helps us have the high, like the joy, and appreciate what we're grateful for, but it also allows us to be not so disillusioned or disheartened if something maybe isn't as we anticipated it could be. So to follow up with that, think about how cycles of rebirth allow us to think of our parents now in positive terms. So we said that things that are ongoing and charitable for our life and maybe our parents' life, our ancestors, is to have kind thoughts about them. So if you, for example, had a really, really difficult childhood and maybe your parents aren't living anymore, and anytime you are struggling with something, you almost want to like have these negative thoughts about them. So instead of thinking in negative terms, think of them as infants, right? And it almost helps the postmodern wheel move forward because then you would say they're probably going to already come back into a world and be more advanced and progressive than me. Because by the time I'm passing out of the world, they're going to be moving ahead. And I want to help them progress forward. And in doing that, I'm almost breaking my own cycle of trauma. So that's going to help me when I come back into the world, and it's going to help propel me into a better. So you can imagine why the narrative says be kind to your parents, because in a way it's going to come back to you and it's going to help you with your cycle of life and death. So these new ideas, they're probably not new. They're probably just lost somewhere in history, their archives, because if I'm thinking about them, somebody already did the work in the past, right? And I'm maybe just questioning it in the universe, so it aligns with me. And then I get to pass it on, like into that global network, like we talked about. And then someone might go into their history and say, "Oh, we thought about that, but then we wrote it off because we didn't know how to maybe interpret it into our like body of texts, maybe in the West or maybe in the East." So back to my professor, one thing that I learned with studying a little bit of the Asian religions is that nirvana is really difficult to kind of come to terms with. Like they'll say after you die, you just go into this space and there's no kind of conscious awareness of it. And that makes sense because we kind of talked about how when people dream, they don't necessarily have a recollection of any idea. They just, it's like this gap and then they wake up and then hopefully they feel rested. But within the Buddhist tradition, there's something called the bodhisattva, which is almost like people who almost intend to want to come back in the world and help in some way. So that's almost like asking the universe for beneficial knowledge. Like, even if I don't come back because I don't believe in rebirth, I want to leave, like, some people call it like a legacy. I want something that's going to stay in the world, that's going to help people in the future. And you can think of it in terms of enlightenment. It's going to help the way they think, the way they evolve, and how we progress as humanity. So back to the idea about the book that I borrowed from the library, and why sometimes beginning with something that is a model, like a toy. So, for example, if you're thinking, I don't know, like, what is it that I can invent that's not already invented? Go with that. So think, okay, so like maybe think about the Google glasses that we sometimes see commercials for, right? That kind of have like this almost Mission Impossible or Jarvis kind of um, uh, interface almost, right? So even thinking about something that's really like an everyday object and you wouldn't think that I could maybe evolve something with it, just try it. Especially if you go into physics and go in like research Rube Goldberg machines or all these creative ideas of creating technologies that start something and then it triggers something else and then it creates these mazes and at the end there's usually an outcome that starts something. So these used to be comics that we used to watch a long time ago, and they might have seemed like they were just outrageous or out of this world or not something we'd ever see in reality, right? But they may very well be. Like sometimes you'd see, I wonder if I could wake up in the morning and I could have something that cooks eggs for me. I mean, it's not far off now. We could just go on YouTube or sorry, on our phone and then go to skip the dishes or any of these apps that have food for us ready, and we can just stay in bed and just wait for breakfast to come. Or, a timer, coffee machines rather, right? Where just at a certain time it'll just start creating the coffee experience. Like sometimes it's just the scent of coffee that'll wake you up, and then eventually you'll have your coffee. So all these things are not things that we should write off. Like think of them as inspiration and go with them, even if they look silly or if you even talk about it and people laugh it off, laugh with them, and then it'll actually build the idea forward because you'll be like, oh, and imagine it does this, almost in like a joking way, but it'll eventually, I'm sure it'll materialize because it's coming into mind. It's already partially in existence. Now someone just has to kind of work and see, well, what application in the world is there for this, and who would use it? And then from there, you've already kind of started something that's creative that might give you sort of incentive to find yourself out of a rut if you're struggling to kind of think of a creative idea to move on.